Okay, shall we get started? Okay. Thank you so much for coming to ISOO's 40th birthday party. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you as our guest. We hope you enjoy what we have planned today. I think it'll be an interesting time, and certainly one that will give you, I think, more of a look about not only our history, but where we think we are going. In many ways, this is one of your birthday parties, too. Several of the agencies present this morning not only witnessed our birth, but were part of it. Although we officially claim as our birthday December 1st, 1978, the day President Jimmy Carter signed Executive Order 12065, which established ISOO as part of the General Services Administration, our roots can really be traced back to June 7th, 1972. On that rainy and humid day, Ambassador John Eisenhower presided over a meeting in the White House's Roosevelt Room. With him were the Deputy Archivist of the United States and 6 senior officials from the Departments of State, Justice, Defense, the CIA, the then Atomic Energy Commission, and the National Security Council. As so often is the case in Washington, a lingering crisis had brought this meeting about. Almost exactly a year before, the New York Times and Washington Post had rocked the Nixon White House and the National Security Establishment by publishing the Pentagon Papers, a highly classified study of nearly 7,000 pages spelling out how the United States had become entangled in the Vietnam War. After it failed to stop it in the courts, the publication of this study was 47 volumes. The Nixon White House began grappling with the stark reality that the executive branch lacked a credible, regulated way to declassify national security information. President Nixon remedied this on March 8, 1972, when he signed Executive Order 11652, titled Classification and Declassification of National Security Information and Material. To oversee its implementation, the executive order's drafters created an Interagency Classification Review Committee to monitor its implementation. President Nixon appointed John S.D. Eisenhower, a son of Dwight Eisenhower, President Dwight Eisenhower, to be the committee's new chair. Eisenhower, who landed on the blood-spattered beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, served as our ambassador to Belgium and later wrote a well-received book on the Battle of the Bulge, captured the novelty and reality of what he and the others were about to take on in his opening remarks to the committee. This is Eisenhower speaking, quote, "We all realize," he said, "that we are going into a process of pioneering. We're going into unknown territory and is yet undetermined as to the volume of effort that this is going to be required of us. But this very unknown quantity is part of what makes this job so exciting. I am impressed by the wide range of responsibilities that this committee is going to be faced with. In light of these, it is quite obvious that this committee is going to have to remain as high level and broad in its activities as possible. We're going to have to act in a supervisory capacity. Watchdog is the word one newspaper has used. If we tried to perform all our tasks without decentralization, we would have to build a staff comparable to a separate agency or department. Thus, the only way we can do what is expected of us is to depend on the departments and agencies you represent. The people in your organization are going to have to do the vast bulk of the spade work under this committee's supervision and monitoring." Eisenhower's prescient observations remain as true today as when he first spoke them in 1972. ISOO's oversight relies very much on the partnerships we forged 4 decades ago. We have striven hard to be a fair and impartial overseer. ISOO remains what the Washington Post called in 1977 the classification bureaucracy's court of last resort, guided by our twin missions of protecting national security while enhancing our citizens' faith in their government. As director of the ISOO, I receive my policy directions from the National Security Council and report directly to David Ferriero, the 10th Archivist of the United States. I consider myself to be especially fortunate in having David as my boss. I know of no public servant more deeply committed to the principles of an open government. In August 2012, NARA, under his guidance, produced the Managing Government Records Directive to modernize and improve federal records practices and to increase their availability to the American people. The former librarian at Duke University, that's why I'm wearing a UVA tie today, He came to the National Archives after serving as the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the New York Public Libraries. He's the first librarian to serve as the Archivist of the United States. His love of books makes him not only one of the most widely read people I know, but also one of the best informed. I've come to rely heavily on his guidance and judgment. A naval hospital corpsman during the Vietnam War, David personifies the public servant intellectual, a humane and lettered man of action. David?
Good morning and welcome to my house. It's nice to have you here as we celebrate 40 years of the Information Security Oversight Office. After this event, I invite you to visit our exhibit galleries upstairs. Our current exhibit, Remembering Vietnam, closes on January 6th. It follows American involvement in Vietnam from World War II through the fall of Saigon, and uses newly discovered and declassified original documents, photographs, film footage, and artifacts to illuminate 12 critical episodes that divided the peoples of both the United States and Vietnam. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to pay tribute to Steve Garfinkel, the longest-serving director of ISOO, who passed away in September. Steve began his career at the General Services Administration, where he became an expert on information policy issues and managed legal issues for the National Archives and Records Service, then a part of the General Services Administration. He helped draft the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act of 1974 and the Presidential Records Act in 1978. President Jimmy Carter appointed him director of ISOO in 1980, and he went on to serve for almost 22 years. During that time, he made an indelible mark on the classification system, and he helped draft executive orders, including Executive Order 12937, which resulted in the declassification of almost 44 million pages of records from World War II to the Vietnam War here at the National Archives. And Executive Order 12958, which was a watershed event for declassification policy, with the establishment of the concept of automatic declassification, which has defined declassification ever since. In 2000, he was also appointed chair of the Nazi War Crimes and Japanese Imperial Government Interagency Working Group. Under Steve's leadership, the executive branch declassified over 8 million pages of responsive records. After Steve retired from federal service, President George W. Bush recognized his expertise and appointed him as a member of the Public Interest Declassification Board. Steve believed strongly in transparency and in the importance of history, and later earned his teaching certificate and became a beloved high school history teacher in Montgomery County, Maryland. It was this last job that he treasured most of all. On a significant anniversary, it's customary to reflect on the preceding years and examine how we arrived at where we are today. 40 years ago, on June 28, 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed Executive Order 12065, National Security Information, which established ISOO as a part of GSA. With this, ISOO became responsible for overseeing compliance with the classification, safeguarding, and declassification programs in executive branch agencies. Since then, the initial responsibilities assigned to ISOO have both changed and grown as subsequent presidents have exercised their authority regarding information security. In 1993, ISOO became responsible for aspects of the National Industrial Security Program established by Executive Order 12829. In fiscal year 1995, ISOO moved briefly from GSA to the Office of Management and Budget. Then, and of particular significance, in fiscal year 1996, ISOO came to the National Archives. This marked the beginning of a period of significant growth in the capability, prominence, and results of ISOO. At that time, the Commission on Protecting and Reducing Secrecy, the Moynihan Commission, remarked in its final report that ISOO had, quote, achieved some success in the face of limited resources and personnel and being shuffled among 3 different agencies in as many years, unquote, but that it, quote, did not conduct a single on-site review of any agency's classified product for the 2 years between 1994 and 1996, unquote. That quickly changed. When ISOO arrived at NARA, it was a staff of 10. Today, it consists of a staff of 25. In 1996, it was tucked into a small corner of this building with a single outdated secure conference room with nothing more than 2 secure phones and a secure fax. Today, it occupies new and expanded office spaces and multiple secure areas, and it utilizes a variety of secure communication tools. As ISOO grew and it built on its strong reputation as an honest broker, always striving to strike the right balance between secrecy and openness, the executive branch again brought additional authority to ISOO. In 2000, it became responsible for supporting the Public Interest Declassification Board. In 2010, it gained responsibilities related to information sharing policies for state, local, tribal, and private sector entities. In that same year, it was named as the executive agent for implementing and overseeing the program established under Executive Order 13556 for controlled unclassified information. Throughout its history, ISOO has had a role with respect to mandatory declassification review appeals, but today it supports the expanded mission of the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel. ISOO has been a component of the National Archives for more than half of its 40 years. It is an indispensable and valued part of this agency. The National Archives plays a vital role in our democracy and serves as our nation's record keeper, holding the records of the federal government in trust for the American people. Our mission is to provide public access to these records. Public access strengthens democracy by allowing Americans to claim their rights to citizenship, hold their government accountable, and understand their history so that they can participate more effectively in their government. And ISOO plays an important role in this mission. With their oversight and assistance, executive branch agencies have declassified many hundreds of millions of pages of historical records. The National Archives is the beneficiary of this work and makes these declassified records available to the public in our research rooms, online, and in exhibits like Remembering Vietnam upstairs. Once declassified, these records help Americans understand their history and the actions of their government, and they can help citizens participate in their government in a more informed manner. President Carter envisioned ISOO as the government's expert on classified national security information policy, and it has proven itself time and time again over the last 40 years. ISOO has always sought to balance the need for secrecy and the need for transparency. Secrecy is important to protect our national interests and our security. Transparency is equally important in our democracy to provide citizens with information that affords them the opportunity to engage and participate. As ISOO begins its 5th decade, its work takes on new importance. In its most recent annual report to the President, ISOO called for reforms to the classification and declassification systems. Driving changes to address the realities of electronic records is critical to the health of the classification system, as well as for the life cycle of records. When he created ISOO, President Carter had a vision to reform the classification system. At the time, he stated, quote, "While some material must be classified, the government classifies too much information, classifies it too highly and for too long. These practices violate the public's right to know, impose unnecessary costs, and weaken protection for truly sensitive information by undermining respect for all classification," unquote. President Carter's order did improve the classification system, and those themes have been echoed by presidents in their EOs and ISOO directors alike in the 40 years since. The world has changed remarkably in the past 40 years. I don't think any of us could imagine the changes that have occurred in how information is created, used, and shared. The one constant has been the call of ISOO for continual and meaningful reform. Progress has been made, but reforms have not kept pace with the way government operates. Our government is increasingly digital, and this has led to an exponential growth of government data and how it is created, disseminated, used, and stored. There's widespread agreement among leaders and users on the need to modernize the classification system, and similarly our records management policies. Modernization will require the adoption of new policies and increased use of technology. As the life cycles of classified information and records are inextricably linked, modernization is both an imperative for the National Archives. I've highlighted aspects of the large role played by ISOO today as they work to assist, oversee, and partner with many others who have a role in the complex information security arena. And I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to highlight and thank the many departments and agencies, congressional committees, and National Security Council staff and public interest groups who have played a real and meaningful role in the history of ISOO. Let me close by thanking our keynote speaker, Tom Blanton, and the former ISOO directors who are with us today. I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts on ISOO's past and its future. After all, carved on the monumental statues on Pennsylvania Avenue, study the past and what is prologue dictate the mission of this agency. I'd like to also thank Mark Bradley and his staff for the work that they do every day to help the American people access the records that they need. And now I have the honor of reading to you a letter delivered this morning from the White House, which is in very small type, to the Honorable David Ferriero. Congratulations to the Information Security Oversight Office for its 40 years of distinguished service to the American people. For 4 decades, ISOO has made significant contributions to the safety and security of our nation. The dedication of those serving ISOO has helped ensure appropriate sharing and safeguarding of national security information across government and industry, and improved declassification practices for greater government transparency and accountability. The team at ISOO should feel tremendous pride in its outstanding work protecting the American people at home and abroad. I am confident ISOO will continue its work advancing issues of critical importance to national security. Thank you for your exceptional leadership and congratulations on this remarkable achievement. Sincerely, Donald J. Trump. Thank you.
Good morning. Our keynote speaker, Thomas Blanton, is the director since 1992 of the independent, non-governmental National Security Archive at George Washington University. He won the 2004 Emmy Award for Individual Achievement in News and Documentary Research, and on behalf of the archive, received the George Polk Award in 2000 for piercing self-serving veils of government secrecy. He co-founded the virtual network freedominfo.org and serves on the steering committee of the U.S. Public Interest Coalition openthegovernment.org and the International Open Government Partnership. The National Freedom of Information Act Hall of Fame elected him member in 2006, and Tufts University presented him the Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award in 2011 for decades of demystifying and exposing the underworld of global diplomacy. His articles have appeared in Diplomatic History, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, among many other journals. And he is series co-editor for the National Security Archive's online and book publications of more than 1 million pages of declassified U.S. government documents obtained through the archive's more than 60,000 Freedom of Information Act requests. His books include The Chronology, 1987, on the Iran-Contra scandal, White House Email, 1995, on the landmark lawsuit that saved over 220 million records, and Masterpieces of History, 2010, on the collapse of communism in 1989, and is the author of a variety of articles in many different publications. His books have been awarded the 2011 Linkule Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, selection by Choice Magazine as Outstanding Academic Title 2017, and the American Libraries Association's James Madison Award citation in 1996, among other honors. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Blanton.
Thank you, Greg, very much. I'm a stand-in today for Steve Aftergood, who was going to be here and give you an elegant architecture of the entire national security classification system and ISOO's role as the keystone in the arch that holds it all up. And I can't do that, but I've got some stories to tell about ISOO. A couple of good ones, a couple of bad ones, and then I'm going to end with a tribute to Steve Garfinkel, because Garfinkel's legacy, in my mind, meets the challenge, I think, of the next 40 years. ISOO's had a great first 40. I think it's the next 40 that are going to give you real problems with the tsunami of electronic records. But let me just say, Steve Aftergood and I had a lot in common. Pleased to be a body double for him. He and I have been tag teaming the secrecy system for many, many years, including arguing with Steve Garfinkel. But he and I belong to a choice group of people who are members of the ISOO fan club. And I just want to say, true confessions, back in the 1980s, when I first heard about this thing, ISOO, what really came to mind was that Johnny Cash song. Know that one, A Boy Named ISOO, A Boy Named Sue? Right? A girl would giggle and I'd turn red, a boy would laugh and I'd bust his head. I cursed the day that my daddy named me ISOO, right? But by the end of that song, you got Johnny Cash giving the name credit for putting gravel in their guts and grit in their eye and all that. Well, I can say to this day that ISOO has had an extraordinary gift in the United States government for attracting human beings who have gravel in their guts, stand-up people. They're in this front row here, they're scattered around this room, and alumni are throughout this government, and we're the better for it. I just want to say that up front. It turned out, as I learned more, it wasn't just Johnny Cash, it was, ISOO was our friend. I'm an outsider here. Now, I shouldn't say this too loudly because somebody from CIA might be here and they might go back and rescind all those performance awards that John Fitzpatrick got before he crossed the river a few years back. But I want to say something serious about that, which is that ISOO is a friend of a rational secrecy system. We don't have one yet. It's an aspiration. It's an aspiration I share, Steve Aftergood shares, I think we all share. We got problems. I always say our secrecy system is a bunch of low fences around vast prairies of classified information, when what we actually need are huge, high, insurmountable fences around very small graveyards of what truly deserves to be secret. And we're not there yet. I want to talk about two examples of ISOO's really real impact. Out of many, many that I could pick. And one would be one of those executive orders that David mentioned, the one under Clinton. In many respects, I would say that's the most effective executive order on classification we've ever had. Obama's executive order is better language, but like his Nobel Peace Prize, it was aspirational. We're not even close there yet. There's this wonderful, section 3D1 or 31D or 31E, which basically makes the director of ISOO, gives him authority to declassify anything. Agency can appeal to the National Security Advisor, so maybe, Mark, you shouldn't set out to use that quite yet. But I would say Clinton's was the most effective one because at a fundamental level, it represented that post-Cold War shift. And I'll single out just one provision, something it's a mouthful, the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel. And in my shop, we've turned FOIA into a verb. You FOIA something. Well, when you ISCAP something, that means you're going to get a decent hearing. and they're going to look at the evidence, and about 70% of the time, they're going to agree with the National Security Archive and not with the CIA. It's a fascinating track record because what ISCAP did was prove a point that people like me had been arguing for a long time, which is that if you could just tear all those classified documents out of the cold, dead hands of the agencies that had created them and put them under an independent microscope, you'd actually come up with a different set of decisions that were far more pro-openness, pro-accountability than you'd have otherwise. And that is a more rational system. A rational system, according to Justice Potter Stewart in the Pentagon Papers case, is known by disgorging the maximum amount of declassified information. In other words, ye shall know its credibility by the trickle or by the flood. And if the flood comes from Edward Snowden and not from the Freedom of Information Act, then the emperor has no clothes, in both meanings of that phrase. Now, of course, after Clinton, the agencies hated that flood of the 1990s, hated it. So by about 1999, the CIA and the DIA, and they were abetted by the Air Force and a few others, suckered the National Archives into a secret reclassification program. And this is where I think, and this is really to the credit of ISOO, because once, it took us about, 6 years, Matthew Aid and the National Security, we finally compared notes, and it turns out we had hundreds of those records that had been taken out of the public shelves. And we took it to the press, made the front page of the New York Times. But you know, one of the most interesting things about that front page article is that it had, I'd say, a dozen quotes from ISOO, from Bill Leonard, who took a look at the first 16 examples, I think, that we had come up with and said, you know, none of these deserve to be classified. Why are they reclassified? That straight-up approach. We're going to show you what we do. We're going to go do an audit. We're going to publish those secret memorandums of understanding. We're going to take it seriously. What that meant was that at the end of the process, when ISOO said, well, you know something? Some of these reclassifications were justified. People like me could say, well, I disagree with that, but I sure respect your judgment. That's credibility. That's credibility. So those are the good news. And then there's the bad news. So when I try to describe our national security secrecy system, I always go back to the text, the godfather. The founder of our national security secrecy system was a guy named General Leslie Groves. He's the guy who presided over the Manhattan Project, built the atomic bomb, total secrecy. And his son tried to help him write his memoirs sometime in the 1950s, and his son said, Daddy, you know, it's really puzzling me, all this secrecy you put around the Manhattan Project. I really don't get that, because you testified before Congress there was really only one actual nuclear secret, just one, that it blows up. And once you know that it blows up, any competent physicist can walk backward and figure out how to build one, design one. So why was all the secrecy? And it was a fascinating answer. Stan Norris published it in his biography of Groves called Racing for the Bomb. And part of it you'd totally expect, but part of it you wouldn't, and that's the challenge for the next 40 years. So Leslie Groves said the reason for all the secrecy was, of course, the Nazis. And, of course, the Japanese. And, of course, those temporary allies of ours, those Soviets, right? But then there was also the Allies. We don't want any, those Brits, can't trust them with a bomb. Are you kidding, right? The next item on this list, you'll love this one, just given that the Constitution is right in this building. Groves said, Congress. That's who the secrecy is protecting us against. Congress. And he said, and any of those other executive agencies that might mess with our budget. That's what it's protecting us against. And then he says, oh, and of course, and keep all decisions about nukes in the hands of a very small group, elite decision makers. And he says, and of course, to run the thing on need to know and compartmentation. He invented compartments. And there was a little subtext in there. That'll help us keep those unruly scientists under control. There you go. There you have the multiple motivations of our national security secrecy system that present us with major problems going down the road. Now, when you've got that kind of system and you've got this great appeals process, but seems like nobody in the system seems to learn from ISCAP. There's not a systematic way in which those great ISCAP release decisions are getting into the mindsets of those reviewers. And there seems to be no penalties on the reviewers for continuing to waste the public's resources with forcing us to bring appeals to ISCAP. The reinforcing loop just isn't there yet. And part of that reminds me of that James McMurtry song. I don't know if you know Level Land. It's about the migration west, and he says, flatter than a tabletop, makes you wonder why they stopped here. Wagon must have thrown a wheel, or they lacked ambition. One. Well, I'm here to say, be the skunk of the garden party, ISCAP lacks ambition. When you have an enormous backlog like that, and a lack of a serious learning process, and you're at the point where people like us will file our appeals to ISCAP, after waiting a year, no answer, ignored by the agency, ISCAP now tells us, well, we can't even deal with those. You've got to have an actual denial. So we'll wait 5 years, maybe another 5 years. Huge backlog. We got to scale up. I know resources are a huge issue, but I think there's some other ways to address it, and I'm going to come to that with my story about Steve Garfinkel. Larger problem in many respects. David Ferriero is just too nice. National Archives is just too nice. National Archives needs to seize from the agencies control over those old records. 25 years and older, decisions should be at the National Archives and the National Declassification Center. We should use Clause 3D or 3.1e. At 25 years, there's a different standard. It's in the executive order. We all know it from common sense, but it's power. And I think in the National Archives, all power to the National Archives. That's my view. And I do think that we have got to use technology to address these problems, new technology to deal with the tsunami of records. I mean, I'm one of the big tech skeptics. I think the only revolution that social media has really brought to us is undermining our democracy. It's not the Russians, it's Facebook's business model. That's the part of the problem. But I want to tell you my Steve Garfinkel story. This is the end of my exhortation today, because it speaks to all these sets of issues, and it's a tribute to him. Now, last December, in an interview with Bloomberg News, I told a Steve Garfinkel story. And it was one I'd heard many years ago. I probably got parts of it wrong, but maybe not. The story was about a skiff down at Maxwell Air Force Base in Birmingham, Alabama, that Steve Garfinkel walked into one day. And there's just walls of boxes, the Army Air Corps and flight tests from the 1920s and 1940s, and, you know, huge body of hundreds and hundreds of boxes. And the way I remember Steve told the story is that he pulled a few off the shelf, made sure there was no nukes in there, no spooks in there, sort of core, you know, things that need to be protected. Took a look at the room and kind of, by the power invested in me by the executive order, I pronounced thee declassified. It was wonderful. Room by room declassification, not page by page or line by line, right? So I tell this story to Bloomberg, they publish it, and a few days later, it was actually Christmas morning, December 25th, I get this email from Steve Garfinkel. I just like to read it because it speaks in his voice rather than me paraphrasing. Dear Tom, by retiring after 32 years and becoming a high school social studies teacher, parentheses, semi-honest work, close parentheses, for the last 14 plus years, I've largely succeeded in blanking out my previous life. Every once in a while, something pops up to make me recall there was even such a life. Your Bloomberg interview, which I happened to trip upon online and which one or two others sent to me, was just such a pop-up. I had long ago forgotten my foray into declassifying by room contents, but your reference to it brought the experience back vividly and put a big smile on my face. I would imagine it put a big frown on the faces of a few others. I further suspect if I had performed that task page by page, I would still be in the middle of it unless suicide intervened. Thank goodness. Thank goodness I left when electronic records were still a peripheral but looming issue. I have to believe the scope of classified information, indeed any information beyond human end solutions today, even though the very technology that proliferates it could also be put to use in managing and declassifying it. I'll leave those problems up to you and your ilk. That was a classic Steve phrase. You and your ilk on the many sides of the issues raised. Congratulations on your stubbornness. I wrote back to Steve, telling him what a hero he was to me, not least the heroism of going to teach public high school. That was above and beyond the call. I said, I just admired then and admire now your guts. Few in the government ever exhibit such intestinal fortitude. We need more of you. In the ultimate sense, you were right back in the 90s about the necessity of a sunset on all government secrets. Without a drop-dead date, there'll be infinite reviews. Yes, tech ought to help, but if we don't put a date certain on the record up front or a deadline on the back for every category, I still think we're stuck. And every bureaucratic imperative will keep us stuck. And he wrote back, many thanks for your very kind words, and keep up the good fight. It's absolutely essential. So I'm here today to honor Steve Garfinkel and to honor ISOO and to hand off a little piece of high tech to help Mark in dealing with this tsunami of electronic records to come. It's kind of from the Garfinkel legacy. It's a magic wand. I call it the Garfinkel Wand. You walk into a skiff holding this thing, kind of like Harry Potter, right, would walk into one of those dark hallways at Hogwarts. May such a wand find its way into the pocket of every declassification reviewer. May such a wand give strength and backbone to every declassifier, like Steve Garfinkel's backbone. And I would just say last, it's made out of stainless steel, like Steve Garfinkel's character. May we be like Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blanton. Good morning. I'm Bob Scarratt from ISOO. As one of two current ISOO staff members who work for Steve Garfinkel, I've been given the honor of recounting Steve's remarkable career. Steve entered government service with a distinguished academic record. He earned a Bachelor of Arts with distinction from George Washington University, attended his law school as a trustee scholar, and received a Juris Doctor with honors in 1970. Following law school, Mr. Garfinkel served for almost 10 years in the Office of General Counsel of the General Services Administration. He was Chief Counsel for the National Archives and Records Service, Chief Counsel for Information and Privacy, and Chief Counsel for Civil Rights. In 1974, Steve participated in drafting the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act, through which records relating to the abuse of government power by President Nixon and the White House staff were placed under the custody of the National Archives to process for public access. In May 1980, President Carter appointed Steve Garfinkel to serve as ISOO's second director, succeeding Michael Blanton, who had been director since the founding of ISOO in 1978. Mr. Garfinkel remained at ISOO until his retirement in January of 2002. As director of ISOO, Steve Garfinkel took the lead in building the policy foundation for the security classification system and the National Industrial Security Program. He played a critical role in drafting Executive Order 12958, which, when issued by President Clinton in 1995, established the first requirements for automatic declassification of national security information. At the time, Mr. Garfinkel said, the big thing about the new executive order is that the burden has shifted 180 degrees in terms of maintaining the classified status of information. In the past, in order to declassify, an agency had to commit resources to the process of document review. Now, he stressed, if an agency does nothing, information will be declassified. Steve continued public service after he left ISOO from 2000 to 2006. He chaired the Nazi War Crimes and Japanese Imperial Government Records Interagency Working Group, a vast declassification initiative to implement the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998. Under Mr. Garfinkel's agile stewardship, this landmark effort became the largest congressionally mandated single-subject declassification effort in history. President George W. Bush appointed Steve Garfinkel to the Public Interest Declassification Board, where he served as a member from 2004 to 2008, contributing to the Pitted Report to the President on Improving Declassification, 2007. Steve Aftergood of the Federation of American Sciences wrote that Mr. Garfinkel made the whole system better with the tools that he had available. He instituted training programs for classifiers. He restrained some of the excesses of agency officials, and he cultivated a rational approach to the diverse challenges that the late Cold War classification system produced. As Steve Garfinkel was nearing retirement, the Archivist of the United States, John Carlin, presented him with the Lifetime Achievement Award. Mr. Carlin remarked, "As the leading architect of the current government-wide security classification system, Steve crafted a system that has produced the largest number of pages declassified in the history of the government's program, more than 800 million pages. With more than 30 years of government service, Steve is one of the best examples of a dedicated public servant. He has kept the beacon burning bright for a democracy that keeps its citizenry informed and yet protects its nation's secrets as it must." Steve also earned 19 commendations and citations from Presidents Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Reagan, Carter, and Ford. These include the Presidential Rank Award of Meritorious Federal Executive. He has also received awards and commendations from many federal departments and agencies and from non-government professional and service organizations. In 1989, the American Defense Preparedness Association presented Mr. Garfinkel with its first Security Man of the Year award. In 1990, the National Classification Management Society made him an honorary member, and in 1999 presented him with its President's Award. "He was a monumental man, a man of great honor and integrity," wrote Roger Denk, the former director of the Defense Personnel and Security Research Center. "His sense of humor, combined with his brilliance, made him a joy to be around." You would think that after having spent more than 3 decades in government service, Steve would have actually retired. Instead, he took on another great challenge. He received a master's degree in teaching from Towson University. He became a high school teacher in Montgomery County, Maryland. He loved teaching. He was a great teacher, and his students loved him. It should have been no surprise. His intellect, his passion for life, his sense of humor, his deep sense of commitment and purpose, and most of all, his humanity connected him with his students as it connected him with those of us who knew him in the government. He may not be with us today, but his legacy lives on. It lives on in the classification system, and it lives in his students. Steve Garfinkel passed away on September 24th, 2018, at the age of 17. He was the beloved husband of Tilly Garfinkel, devoted father of Laura Kleiman and Ken Garfinkel, beloved grandfather of Cara and Eric Kleiman, and cherished brother of Rita Bierman and the late Larry Garfinkel. Thank you, Tilly, and other family members who join us today. We'd now like to share some images of Steve Garfinkel.
Thank you, Mr. Scrott. Let's observe a moment of silence to honor Steve Garfinkel's life of service. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. As I read your name, please take your place up here on the stage. J. William Leonard, Bill Leonard, serves as the Chief Operating Officer at the National Endowment for Democracy. With his wide-ranging leadership experience as a senior policymaker and senior program manager within the federal government, where he has worked principally in the areas of information security at both the Department of Defense, where he rose to the rank of Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Security and Information Operations, and at the National Archives as the Director of the Information Security Oversight Office. Prior to coming to the staff of the Secretary of Defense in 1996 as Director of Security Programs, Mr. Leonard served as an Assistant Deputy Director at the Defense Investigative Service. In that capacity, he was responsible for a wide range of policy and operational matters pertaining to the DoD's administration of the National Industrial Security Program, both within the U.S. and overseas. Mr. Leonard was also instrumental in the establishment of the DIS Counterintelligence Office. Mr. Leonard holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Relations from Boston University and a Bachelor of Arts degree in History from St. John's University in New York City. He has served as an adjunct professor of political science at St. Mary's College of Maryland and resides in Leonardtown, Maryland. William J. Vasenka was appointed as the Chief Operating Officer of the National Archives effective January 1st, 2013. Prior to this appointment, he served as NARA's Executive for Agency Services and was responsible for NARA's efforts nationwide to service the ongoing records management needs of federal agencies and to represent the public's interest in the accountability and transparency of these records. Mr. Vasenka previously served as the Director of ISOO from January 2008 to March of 2011, where he was responsible for oversight of the government-wide security classification system and the National Industrial Security Program. Mr. Vasenka began his career with NARA in February 1993, first as an archives technician and later as an archivist, that's archivist with a capital A, working on NARA's Special Access and FOIA staff and NARA's Records Declassification Division. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from Susquehanna University. Next up is John P. Fitzpatrick. He serves the National Security Council as the Senior Director for Records Access and Information Security Management. He chairs both the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel and the Records Access and Information Security Policy Coordination Committee. He oversees NSC responsibilities for records management, the Presidential Records Act compliance, declassification review, FOIA, publication review, and liaison with presidential libraries concerning access to the records of past administrations. Prior to his tenure at NSC, Mr. Fitzpatrick served as the Director of ISOO. Previously, Mr. Fitzpatrick served as the Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Security, the Principal Advisor to the Director of National Intelligence on matters regarding the protection of national intelligence and intelligence sources and methods. With over 34 years in the intelligence community, Mr. Fitzpatrick also served as a member of the Senior Intelligence Service in Security and Management Disciplines at the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office. Mr. Fitzpatrick was awarded the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal in December 2011 and the Office of the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service in October 2008. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and psychology from the College of William and Mary. Mark Bradley. The President of the United States approved Mr. Bradley's appointment as Director of ISOO effective December 2016. Mr. Bradley has been a member of the federal government's senior executive service since 2003. Mr. Bradley previously served as the Director of FOIA, Declassification, Pre-Publication Review of the National Security Division, the Office of Law and Policy at the Department of Justice. While at the department, he also served as the Deputy Counsel for Intelligence Policy and the Acting Chief for Intelligence Oversight. Before joining the Department of Justice in November 2000, Mr. Bradley served as a CIA intelligence officer and Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's legislative assistant for foreign affairs and intelligence matters, and as his last legislative director. Mr. Bradley, who remains a member of the D.C. Bar, also served as a criminal defense lawyer in the District of Columbia, defending indigents accused of serious crimes. The Society for History in the Federal Government awarded a very principled boy, his biography of Soviet spy Duncan Lee, its 2015 George Pendleton Prize for being the best book written by a federal historian in 2014. Mr. Bradley is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Washington and Lee University and holds an MA in Modern History from Oxford University, where he attended as a Rhodes Scholar, and a JD from the University of Virginia. I've worked for each one of these men. I've worked with John Powers, too. John Powers, he's the moderator, recently returned to the Information Security Oversight Office as the Associate Director in the Classification Management Directorate. In this role, he leads a team of analysts in advising government agencies in security classification policies for classifying, declassifying, and safeguarding national security information. From May 2015 to June 2018, John served on the staff of the NSC as Director for Access and Information Management. Previously, John served in several capacities at NARA. From 2008 to 2015, he served as a senior analyst at ISOO, where he created an evaluation program for executive branch declassification programs. He also served as the senior staff officer for the Public Interest Declassification Board. Now, John began his NARA career in 1991 as an archives aide at the Nixon Presidential Materials Project, eventually serving as the acting director in 2007. John received a BA in International Relations from the College of William & Mary in 1989 and an MA in American History from George Mason University in 1999. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Heather, and two children, Cameron and Annika. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
All right. See, can everybody hear me? Make sure our microphones are on. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I've got the honor of serving as the moderator today. Actually, I was on leave the day they were looking for a moderator. So I'm looking forward to this discussion with four very distinguished ISOO directors. I've also had the privilege, like Bill, to work with all four of them. I was asking my colleague this morning, I was like, well, what do you think I should ask him? And he responded, we kind of laughed about it a little bit. It was like, I think it'd be kind of fun to ask them the questions they asked us in our job interviews. But seriously, we're going to talk about their work at ISOO. We're also going to get them to talk a little bit about what they think the future of information security ought to look like as well, especially given their long backgrounds and accomplishments. I hope that you'll find it an interesting discussion. So let me first begin. Listening to Bill Carpenter's introduction, all four of these directors came from different agencies to ISOO and brought different perspectives to ISOO. Mark came from the Department of Justice, John from the intelligence community, Jay, homegrown from the National Archives, and of course Bill Leonard from the Department of Defense. So I'd like to start maybe by asking each of them, and why don't I start with Bill and work my way down. How did you decide to come to ISOO, and what perspective did you bring to the job coming from your old agency?
Well, my first, John, real interaction with ISOO dates back to, I guess, the early 1990s and the formulation of the National Industrial Security Program. And that was an experience that, for me, crystallized what's the difference between tourists and federal bureaucrats in this town. And that's the willingness to fight and die in the street to defend agency prerogative. It was quite a hassle to try to get something such as the National Industrial Security Program off the ground. But it was my first real introduction to the interagency process. And as arduous and as difficult as that process could be, I also saw that it was an opportunity to make a real difference government-wide, to be actively engaged in that process and to be able to influence and direct it. So that was my first encounter with ISOO, and it was probably what stayed with me all through the years, so that when the opportunity presented itself then after Steve's retirement, I said, yeah, that's something I think I'd like to get involved with and quite frankly, be able to continue the legacy of Steve, who I think was kind of an expert at that, coordinating that interagency process.
Jay?
So my first introduction to ISOO was as a archivist trainee in a training program. There was an opportunity to do some details, and I was supposed to do a 2-week detail in the public programs area. But at that time, I was a D-class archivist, spending my days in a locked vault, and the idea of public programs sort of perplexed me a little bit. And ISOO had just arrived at the National Archives, and so I pitched the idea of doing a detail at ISOO, and Steve Garfinkel agreed, although he said, look, 2 weeks, you're not going to get anything out of it, I'm not going to get anything out of it, so it's got to be at least 30 days. And 30 days turned into 120 days. And during that period, I went with Steve to a meeting. It was up in Germantown. I still have the memo that I was tasked with writing a memo for the record for him after that meeting. But it was about a subject, declassification topic, and we had representatives from the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Energy, and Steve was sort of chairing the meeting, but it was up in Germantown. And one by one, everybody said that they were okay declassifying the information issue, but only if the others would, but nobody would agree. But they all agreed that it ought to be declassified. And it really sort of, as a declass person, made me realize sort of the broader set of challenges that are in the declassification area. And found my way, actually 20 years, I guess, tomorrow, December 7th. I came to ISOO, started off as a program analyst, and enjoyed every last little bit. When Bill decided to retire, I looked around as associate director and fretted and mourned and went through all the stages of grief like everybody did when Steve left, and then we were all going through it when Bill was leaving. And it suddenly dawned on me that perhaps it was an opportunity for me to only have myself to blame as far as what I thought of ISOO leadership. And so I enjoyed that opportunity for several years until the archivist asked me to do something different.
And then John came.
That's right. As Tom mentioned, I crossed the river from CIA. I grew up in CIA right out of college, indoctrinated into the way of CIA, which is somewhat heliocentric. You're the center of the universe, and the light is so blinding you can't see any other agency. And ISOO, I think, started to help me join the rest of the executive branch. I recall letters that came signed by Steve Garfinkel. Steve was a signature on a page to a lot of us in the intelligence community. Intelligence community, for all of its self-interest, keeps itself on the periphery as much as it can, and compliance with the annual classification count was my first introduction. And we'd get this template page, and for a week, we'd have to record all the classification, derivative classification decisions that we made and turn that in. And I was sort of fascinated by the simplicity of it and the idealism of that exercise, that somehow, there's this fabulous pyramid upwards of collecting across. And I assumed that every person with a clearance across government did the exact same thing. I later learned there are many methods to that estimation. And then later in a job at the ODNI, I partnered with Bill Leonard on a particular matter, which was ending the portion marking exemption that the intelligence community had for its classification marking practices, a promise that had been made, and Bill, in correspondence and in meetings with me in the brand new ODNI, we ended up changing the intelligence community policy and practice and bringing it in line with the executive order and the CFR as intended. And it's a small-ish thing if you were to study the records and the back and forth of saying you should be doing it this way, we'll do it this way in some number of years. Bill comes back, those number of years have passed, you'll do it this way now, right? And we in fact said, yes, indeed, and taught agencies and brought them into the table. And that, again, another mark where the intelligence community, in my personal recognition, part of something larger. And Bill talked about the interagency, and that once you dive into interagency deliberations on any particular matter, you do see, you're there to defend your agency's interests. But if you're there long enough and you listen, you hear that other agencies have interests that might differ from yours, and you ask the question, why is that, and can we learn from that? And so I think those are things that eventually, when I left CIA and turned in my blue badge, which people were aghast, my generation of CIA employees and the ones before came and stayed forever, and you're leaving. Why are you leaving? And I said, it's a big executive branch. I'm going to go see more of it, and got to do that from here.
John crossed the river, Mark crossed the street.
Yeah. I first came to ISOO in 1998. I was at that time working for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And the senator had co-chaired the Secrecy Commission with Congressman Lee Hamilton. And Moynihan was an extraordinarily broad thinker. And like any broad thinker, he hit upon a lot of difficulties in the secrecy world. And his basic premise was that we classify too much, don't declassify enough. That undermines citizens' confidence in the government. The government itself doesn't even know what it has classified. And so anyway, he tasked me with putting his ideas into legislation. And he came up with an idea called S-22, which was to actually put into legislation what the commission had found. And so anyway, I asked him where I should start, and he said two words. He said, Steve Garfinkel. So I came down the street here and met with Steve. And Steve, if nothing else, was a realist. I mean, he was a lawyer by training, had a very practical mind. And he said, this is great to get the attention on it, but you'll be lucky if you get a third of what you want. And ultimately, you'll probably get a tenth. Steve was right. I mean, that's about what we got. But it was my first exposure to this arcane office that was doing some really interesting work. And the thing that impressed me the most about it is how highly thought of Senator Moynihan was of ISOO. The senator didn't give his praise easily. And he said, this is kind of if you think about it, kind of the Supreme Court of the classification, declassification system. So anyway, fast forward, when the senator retired in 2000, I needed a job. And so I, being a lawyer, I went to the Department of Justice across the street and worked in a very arcane place called the Office of Intelligence Policy and Review. We mostly practiced before the secret court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And in 2003, I became the Department of Justice's voting member on the ISCAP. And so I had day-to-day interaction with ISCAP issues for years, really. And again, it was fascinating for me because, like John, I have a CIA background, so you're taught how important national security is. Yet, I have another background too, which again, being up on the Hill and being a former criminal defense lawyer, again, you can't always trust the government. And so, how does one reconcile that? That's the kind of schizophrenic view of the world. And so I thought there's one answer to that: ISOO. Right? So anyway, in 2016, John stepped down and he asked me if I'd be interested in applying to be the next director. And so anyway, I did. And again, it remains, I think, one of the most fascinating jobs in the government because of the tension in what we deal with. Again, we face very serious threats to our national security, yet we also have an erosion in our credibility with our people, meaning the government does. And so the question is, how do you do both jobs? And I think it's probably one of the most interesting jobs in the government, and certainly one of the most rewarding.
All right. Bill, you came to ISOO in 2002 in the aftermath of two monumental events, the first being the retirement of Steve Garfinkel, and the second being the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. So kind of a two-part question here of what kind of advice did Steve give you, and then how did 9/11 change ISOO and how you adopted new policies?
Steve was, obviously one of the best advocates I knew in terms of the proper balance. And he recognized that that was always very important to me in terms of preserving classification as the critical national security tool it is, but also recognizing that its ill use or abuse can actually undermine our very form of government. And, you know, it turned out to be very timely, you know, being, as you point out, it was immediately post 9/11. And I took it upon myself at that point in time to recognize my first and foremost responsibility was to do no harm, because I recognized that there was tremendous, tremendous pressure, you know, not only within the government, but within the American people at large in terms of we got to do whatever we got to do to protect ourselves. And so if there was ever a time to revert back to the extremes of secrecy in government, going back to the Reagan era and even beyond in terms of some of the draconian approaches to classification, that was it. So more than anything else, first do no harm was kind of my motto. And I'd like to think, together with John's predecessor at the NSC, Bill Leary, we succeeded in doing that, at least when it came to the Bush rewrite of the executive order. Not only substantively, but stylistically. Because stylistically, it's the only executive order that was never referred to by its executive order name. It was always referred to as Executive Order 12958 as amended. And that was deliberate in terms of portraying that, no, this wasn't any earth-shattering shift in approach. It was intended to convey the attitude that we were preserving the essential elements of the Clinton order, which was, you know, the first real reform in this area. And I think both of us were proud that we were able to do that. That said, there were some other challenges in the post 9/11 environment, not the least of which is the imperative for information sharing. As soon as I took the job, Tom Ridge, then the Homeland Security Advisor, came to ISOO and said, hey, I need a framework for the federal government to start sharing classified information with state and local and tribal governments. Never before been thought about in those terms and whatever. And not only that, he said, we want that in 60 days. We missed the 60-day deadline, but we did get it to the White House in 90 days. And, you know, and I'd like to think that that served as the basis, as the foundation for the significant information sharing initiatives then that also came forward in those subsequent years after 9/11.
I'm going to turn a little bit to something that Tom Blanton talked about a little bit too. So President Clinton was the first president to establish the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, and President Bush kept it in EO 13292, the Clinton order as amended. And what's interesting here for Mark and for Bill, both of you served as both the president's representative for your agency, the Department of Defense and Department of Justice, but you also served as the executive secretary, as the director of ISOO. So I'm curious as to how your attitude or how your view of the ISCAP has changed, both with the change in roles and also how it's changed over time. Let me start with Mark.
Well, being a trained lawyer, you know, we're taught that you can have different clients at different stages of your career. So I didn't look upon it as a massive sea change, being a Department of Justice representative, moving over to be the executive secretary. As Tom so eloquently mentioned, I mean, the ISCAP is kind of a jewel in the crown of declassification. And I don't think there's a member on that panel who doesn't take that work extraordinarily seriously because, again, of our high release rate, but it's done in a very deliberate, measured, democratic way. And so that type of collegiality, that type of working together, you know, I don't see any difference at all between what I was doing as the DOJ rep versus being the executive secretary for the entire panel. I think that philosophy permeates the board, and it's certainly bigger than any one member. The biggest difference that I've noticed over the time that I've been on there, the 15 years I've sat on it, is just the explosion in the number of appeals we've been asked to address. And I worry again about getting the material out to the public in a timely way. And so it's become, I think, almost, it used to be a hidden secret. Now it's become a real hot item to file an appeal with ISOO. Part of that problem is it comes out of what's happened to the Freedom of Information Act, especially after 9/11 and after Snowden. You've had an explosion of lawsuits, and so the FOIA shops have become increasingly gummed up, unable to produce information. And so people understand that the ICE cap is probably a better shot at getting what you want. But by the same token, it's difficult to keep up with the volume of work that we have been given.
Let me build off of that real quick before I have Bill follow up here real quick. So Bill was the director, and the ICE cap workload was pretty manageable. It was still that hidden secret. Now, as we've heard from Tom, and from the IC annual reports, it's pretty big. What would you look for the future of ICE cap, and how do you think it would could be changed a little bit to address some of Tom's concerns?
Well, it's a complicated issue because, again, it's such a well-working body. It's unique. It is kind of the Supreme Court, and I am loath, to cut back on what it does. That said, I mean, one of the things that might have to be done is we may have to extend the length of time an appeal can come to ICE cap. Again, things have evolved since since the last executive order. We may have to amend some of our guidelines to be able to keep up with the pace. I mean, I would like to think that we will still be able to do a lot of what we do now. But I must say, those of you who came, we've had 2 now annual ICE cap public forums, which have been very well attended, and we've been very blunt about what we face and about how we're trying to address it. But there may come a time when we are going to have to either limit the number of appeals one individual can file or extend the appeals lengths. One of the things that I've personally advocated for is having a public member of the ICE cap. That's something we've never done before. I think it would be extraordinarily helpful. That person, of course, would have to be cleared and have to sign all the non-disclosure agreements as the rest of us, and we'd have to figure out exactly how that would fit into the mix. But again, I think it would be extraordinarily valuable to have the public insight into how what cases we select to hear, and would, I think, better inform the debate if we had a member from the public on the ICE cap.
Bill, what do you think? What would you change?
I'd have to confess to not being as noble as Mark when I was the DOD rep. Quite frankly, I was one of those bureaucrats fighting and dying and bleeding in the street for agency prerogatives. And that was first and foremost my responsibility back to the Secretary of Defense. And I would look to build alliances. So the CIA may have an equity where they feel very strongly about, Mox Nix to me, but I'd support CIA so that I could be assured that CIA would support me when I had an important issue. And that's how the interagency process works. It's no different than any other group of human beings together, and that's how they operate. And it's very real, and it's not necessarily, it's real, and I'll leave it at that. And it's necessary to take into account, but that's why it's important to have that broad representation in the ICE cap, so that even when DOD and CIA gets in cahoots, there's enough other people looking at it from a different perspective who could hopefully shed light on it. And I really like the idea of a representative of the public.
Jay, do you have any thoughts about what you'd change?
So, with mandatory declassification review, the ICRC, which predated ISOO, had that responsibility at one point, and they struggled to keep up. And then there was a brief period where the ISOO director had the sole authority, and ISOO struggled to keep up. And then we had the ICE cap. And now, as a sort of a victim of its own success, we're facing that same problem. And I think, to me, it gets back to the root issue. Resources help, The staff does an incredible job behind the scenes to try and come up with more efficient ways to move the material through the process. And all the ISCAP reps and the liaisons work incredibly hard to try and make as many decisions as they can. And as Tom pointed out, they do a really good job. The root issue, though, is sort of back with the initial requests. So until we change it so that agencies are cutting a little closer to the bone and not sort of taking the approach of, well, we'll deny it here and it'll get cleaned up on appeal, or when there's some real incentive for them to do that. So, with automatic declassification, the watershed element was that 180-degree shift that, how Steve described it, where the burden shifted, to keep it classified rather than, the declassification work. So right now, what's killing the ISCAP, part of it is the failure of agencies to respond within the timeframes. Well, it's because there's no consequence. There's zero consequence. The only consequence they have is, well, it's going to go to ISCAP. But as has been referenced, ISCAP's at the point now where it's struggling with it. So to me, we're reaching one of those points where there's enough of a critical problem here that there's likely a need to address it in the underlying policy.
John, I'll quickly ask you the same question.
Well, I'm going to align with Jay's interpretation. The ISCAP workload, one, yes, victim of its own success. Yes, victim of agencies' reticence to cut to the bone. So I think those are contributing factors. The ISCAP workload is the tip of an iceberg of mandatory declassification request transactions that happen across government. There are some, and it's a remarkably stable number if we look at the numbers, and 9 or 10,000 MDR cases are made per year. About 1,000 of those, get to second level review, which means there's a large percent. I mean, if you were a process person and a performance statistic person, you'd say this, first level review is 90% successful, and then you would say second level review of those 1,000 cases, maybe 150 or 200 find their way to ISCAP. So you would still be at, of the total percentage, a small percentage that come this way. So if you look at it in the broad sense, you're right to say that more of them are coming in that workload because of the level of performance or non-performance in agency declassification programs. So there's got to be some means to address the prioritization and create an incentive, an appetite to declassify, or a disincentive to allow it to just roll to the ISCAP, because it does clog the pipes in a system that, for those special cases that, there's so many of them, whether it's a one-time requester with a real compelling story that they're trying to get out, or it's just a really complex matter of classification that takes the team a long time to do the research around. That's what you want the ISCAP to be able to do, and more cases are getting there than probably need to.
Let me change topics here a little bit here, and Bill had kind of alluded to a little bit of this too. And I'm going to ask a question for Jay here. Jay actually is the only person up here who served in two directorships at the same time. He was the director of the CUI office and the director of ISOO before it was merged into a single office. So I'm kind of curious about, one, kind of the work that kind of went into drafting the CUI Order 13556 in 2010, and some of the challenges in actually getting that together.
So to be clear, the credit goes to Mike Resnick, who is no longer with us. Mike passed away from a struggle with cancer not too long after the EO was wrapped up. But myself, a couple members of the ISOO staff worked very closely with Mike Resnick and worked to, just like we do with the EOs that we deal with on the classification side, to talk to folks inside government, to talk to the public interest community, to try and figure out how we can craft a piece of policy that will address whatever the challenges or the problems are in a way that makes sense, that is efficient, that's implementable, and what have you. And I think the big challenge with CUI was you were taking a vast, complex body of different markings and controls that had been promulgated over decades, really without any overarching set of controls around them or any oversight, and then trying to craft something that would cover all of them, address all of the public interest community's concerns, address all of the individual authorities that each of the agencies that were impacted in a manner that they would be comfortable. And so in the end, this was true, I think, every one of us up here working on any of whether it's an amendment to an EO or one from whole cloth, the old adage about how the sausage gets made is not being pretty is absolutely right. That 2010 period was coming on the heels of doing the Obama EO in 2009, and so it was just a very intense period of interagency engagement, working with the public interest community, and trying to move something forward that would actually be both implementable and make a difference.
So speaking of implementation, so the order signed in 2010, and it takes many years for that implementing guidance to finally be issued. John, what took so long?
Jay left. I think it's important to, so yes, it did take a long time. I think it's important to note the evolution of the program, and Jay talked about it in its Obama EO instance, but it actually had, that had some momentum from the Bush administration, where the focus in a post-9/11 environment and connecting the dots, which was a big theme in information sharing on the intelligence side, was also in Homeland Security and counterterrorism. And so the scope of the program in that time frame, and the subject of, I think, a 50-page implementation memorandum in the Bush administration, was about counterterrorism and Homeland Security information. And the scope changed for all the reasons that were evident elsewhere in information that was other than CT and Homeland Security. It wasn't being shared properly either. It was subject to these constraints that the order sought to change. But that change in scope is really a vast shift, because going from information that was shared in Homeland Security and counterterrorism instances among an identifiable number of networks to a rubric of any information that any law, regulation, or government-wide policy provides authority to control, that's a huge universe. And the first task, as Jay's team took on, and as I came in was still being worked, was define that universe. And the work of doing that with agencies, so the short answer to your question is it's an education problem at every step of the way. Okay. What information do I have that fits that definition? CT and Homeland Security, only so many agencies had that much information. Law, regulation, government-wide policy, every agency has something there. And then you have to account for it and create a registry of it, which is a fascinating artifact. I think it's a real achievement of the NARA and the interagency. But every agency is like, I don't know. And if you're talking to the security, you have to get the right people in the room. You're talking to security people, they're not the law regulator. They're not going to necessarily know which law gave them that authority. They're going to say, I have an agency policy that tells me that. So education to build the universe of information. And once you have that universe of information, you have to sift through what does every agency do with it now. Agencies don't think about things that are reflexive. So they had to actually examine, well, here's how I protect it in physical space. Here's how I worry about which people have it, or don't worry about which people have it. Here's how I do it in my networks. Here's which networks it's on. That act of discovery by usually one or two people at an agency to go to a huge department, Department of Defense, and any other large ones, but even within a small agency, is a real struggle. It's a struggle because you've got people at junior levels asking questions and getting incomplete answers, and you have to evolve that over time. So I think looking at what was the as-is and then arguing through the interagency process, what's the to-be? How do we want to mark this stuff? How do we want to describe constraints on it? And how do we want to acknowledge the work that's already been done? Everything is about IT. When you're talking about information today, it's that information's container and conveyance is the IT. And so you have to then expand the number of people that are thinking about implementation, from the folks that think about law and regulation, to the folks that think about security, to the folks that think about IT. And in order to get to implementation, you have to have the folks that think about IT modernization. Because if you're going to have a marking tool, if you're going to change the controls on a network, it's going to be done by the IT folks, not by the folks that are talking security policy in a room. So it's really this growing education problem and bringing more and more people in. It just gets complex.
And every time you help somebody understand it, if they move on.
Right, you got to do it again. You got to, and you're back to, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? So it's a challenge.
So speaking of IT reform and modernization and the centrality of that, this is probably a good point to kind of switch over towards the future here. And I've heard Tom has mentioned, the archivist has mentioned the revolution here of EO 12958 in 1995, its amendment in 2003, and then President Obama's order in 2009. That order is almost 10 years old. What needs to be changed? And why don't I start with Bill quickly first?
Well, one thing that needs to be changed, I think, more than anything else, is from a policy and process point of view. I've come to the increasing realization that although classification is rooted in the President's Article 2 constitutional authority, I believe that there are some real needs for the other two co-equal branches of government to kind of step up and fulfill their role in overseeing the exercise of that power. I look back on my career. My career is bookended by probably two of the biggest debacles in our country's history. The beginning of my career was the Vietnam War. At the end of my career was the Iraq War. Obviously, those debacles have their roots in many things, but one of their roots is in the abuse of classification. Tom referenced the Pentagon Papers that concealed the facts from the American people, that resulted in the needless additional expenditure of blood and treasure by this country. The Iraq War, the infamous national intelligence estimate that was misrepresented by the leadership in this government. A misleading, unclassified version of which was shared with Congress, which motivated Congress to authorize the use of military force. The use of classification for purposes other than preserving national security, be it for policy objectives, or be it for what we're seeing today, raw partisan objectives, where members of Congress and even the President of the United States says he'll wield classification or declassification as a political weapon. That, I think, is the biggest risk to a very critical national security tool that this country's safety depends upon, that the men and women who put their very lives on the line for us, their safety, be them in the military, the intelligence, that it depends upon. And I really believe that ISOO, entities like ISOO cannot do it on their own. And I believe Congress needs to step up. The courts need to step up. Legislation probably to ensure some constraints and some accountability needs to be effected. Increased responsibilities for ISOO, increased responsibilities for entities such as the Public Interest Declassification Board. I think it's a critical moment, I think, in the history of the classification system that just calls out for leadership at this critical point in time.
Same question for Mark. A future classification system, what will it look like, and will there be a wand?
God, I hope so. I've got it. We are working now, John and I, on looking at amending the existing executive order. And it's an extraordinary challenge. I think that the Obama era order is a very good one, and we don't want to make anything worse. Don't want to make anything more complicated. That said, you know, the order could be, I think, streamlined a bit. It could be written more concisely. I think that there could be a realization that the only way we're going to really be able to do declassification is probably through some type of priority system. It has to be more targeted. For instance, you know, and Jay and I have talked about this, you know, ad nauseum about the automatic declassification. At the time of the Clinton order, it made a lot of sense. It was a stick to hold over the agencies, 25 years. Now, according to our annual report and the statistics we have about a 55% release rate with automatic declassification. So what's automatic about it? If that's what the figure is, that's a low rate. And so what do we need to do to improve that? On the other hand, you know, I don't want a system that's too complex where the operators and the people in the field can't use it. I often worry it takes more time to mark a document than it does to write it. That's not good for our national security. So again, we have to figure out a way to balance these two competing ideas, again, of protecting national security, but making it more, making information more accessible to the American people. The biggest difference, I think, now than when I first got into this field is just the explosion of information. It is a deluge. And as Tom pointed out, I mean, the electronic and the digital stuff is just beginning to come our way. I worry that we're going to know more about ancient Rome's history than we will about our own. If this keeps up, we won't be able to get to releasing the information. So we've got to be able to harness somehow technology into this to automate more and more of this. And we need to empower, I think, again, especially after 25, 30 years, maybe even 50, more of something like the National Declassification Center to say, you know what, it's long enough. Again, I'm not advocating disclosing human source identities or nuclear information, that kind of thing, but I mean, on the routine stuff, I think we can be a lot more permissive. We need to tighten up the language in the executive order. It is very permissive. It's very widely, you can read it and look at the definitions and it could mean almost anything. So we need to be more exact. We need to be more lawyerly in a way to be able to make the order do what we want it to do instead of giving it too much interpretation. I think if anybody could read that order and come up with different I mean, you could take one provision of it and have 5 people read it, and you'd have 5 different interpretations as to what it means. So we need to keep the flexibility, yet we need to have it more targeted and more concise, and I think more rigorous.
John, what does your future information security system look like?
Well, I'm viewing it from a beach in my retirement. Let me add one comment here before being descriptive in that way. Reform doesn't happen because practitioners like ourselves who've been in a system for decades suddenly have an idea that this could be better and let's do that. We have those ideas. The system relies on us to create those ideas at any particular point in time. But it happens because a senior leader says, I want change. Right? So in the security business classification, this is infrastructure stuff, back in the engine room kind of stuff. If you're a head of an agency, you've got an agency mission, and your job is to keep that mission in your field of vision at all times and have everybody that works for you looking at that and seeing it the same way and moving in the direction of that objective. And then every once in a while, for things like security or audits or whatever, they're in my peripheral vision, I look over and check, is that doing okay? And then I turn my attention back to the mission. Where I've been part of successful security reforms or promising security reforms is when the senior leader takes that security thing and puts it out in the front with the mission and says, this is a mission-enabling thing, and I want these changes to happen. That way, everybody who's a senior leader sees that that's important to the boss, and they suddenly pay attention to something that's in their peripheral vision, that they don't even look over and check because they're not necessarily accountable. So the person at the top demands change, and in the absence of that, we're trying to get their attention to advocate for change and take advantage of an opportunity. Opportunities, I think, I've only seen them come in 2 varieties. Someone is personally engaged in wanting something to be different. I've This was the story of the security clearance reform initiatives. Somebody came into the DNI job or the USDI job and said, my God, we've got to fix this and put it right there. And the other one is crisis. Big mistake. There's a history of them. You can take that cause. We heard Pentagon papers leading to the White House committee leading to the creation of ISOO. You can do the same thing with WikiLeaks, with Snowden. You can trace these things to specific things. So, the cynic in me says, don't let any good crisis go to waste. You want to seize that opportunity to say, well, what we really ought to do is, and bring those ideas that the practitioners and that the public who has interest in this topic pitches into the process and brings that. So, I think, part of our postures, Mark refers to, examination of possible changes that we're looking at now is to try to create that opportunity, try to create that interest. It is not naturally happening. In the Obama administration, there was so much about open government, open data, that when you turn to the national security world, then Mike Resnick's initiatives from the National Security Council and in CUI and other information sharing things, it was a natural fit with something much bigger and broader. So you had this President of the United States saying, I want things to be different. So when you don't have that, you've either got to create that interest and pick your spots, or recognize that an opportunity has presented itself because of world events, and be ready with the ideas.
So I'm curious here, I think we're coming to an end here really quickly. Where do you see ISOO in 5 to 10 years? Each of you just very, very, very quickly. Where do you see the ISOO's oversight role in, and what skills do you think ISOO, and I'm sure there are many security professionals in the audience here, what skills are they going to need to adapt in the next 10 years for that new model that comes up? Why don't I start very quickly with Bill, and I'll just work our way down real quick.
The key, I think, one of the keys, we touched upon it, is, with respect to dealing with the challenges of declassification, whatever, like so many other people, I think part of the solution lies in artificial intelligence. So maybe we need a bunch of Silicon Valley types here within ISOO or whatever, but clearly, I firmly believe if this government took some of the nearly $20 billion a year that we spend on protecting information and just took $1 billion or $2 billion of that and devoted it towards developing those kinds of technologies and applying them, I think it could make a real difference.
Jay?
So I've said it before, the way, and it was sort of a theme that was mentioned in the remarks, the ways in which agencies create, use, share information changes far rapidly than our policy evolves. So, clearly, it's not really so much figuring out how to deal with the deluge that's coming of email and what have you from a declassification perspective. It's really how are we equipping the ISOO staff. The archivist is called on NARA and the agencies to look at this from a records management perspective as well. How are we using information today, and how will we use it tomorrow, and then how do we position ourselves to be equipped to deal with that? And it's more engagement with the CIO community, more engagement to understand how agencies are leaning forward with tech and figuring out what that means from a classification and an oversight perspective, and then on the back end from a declassification perspective.
John?
I think it's agencies that do the work, right? So we all came from different agencies. We grew up in an area where that agency had a mission, and that agency created the material and eventually classified it and will declassify it in most instances. And so I think what ISOO is part of the orchestration of that work. And I want there to be the technology emphasis that we've talked about the need for. We're doing what we can to sort of create the, and also in the work of the Public Interest Declassification Board to describe what the future state of technology is that will do these things, but it is agencies that will have to do those things. I often cite back to a line in the presidential memorandum that accompanied President Obama's executive order, which said, oh, and by the way, SecDef and DNI assist the archivists with the technology part of this. And that direction is there, and we need to grab that and run with it and have agencies recognize, and they do, what's in their interest, and having ISOO in a role of bringing those interests together and showing, here are the collective interests in the way we want to move that forward together. So I do think it is technology, and I think it is ISOO helping to point the way.
Mark?
No, I think I'm going to echo what John said. I think that ISOO will still be here 10, 20 years from now. It will still be, as John Eisenhower so predicted, that we'll be relying mostly on the work of our brethren agencies to be able to do oversight. You know, Supreme Court's had 9 justices for a long time, so I'm not so much worried about the size of ISOO. We can still get things done. What we need to do is do a better job making our notices clearer and getting guidance out to you all to be able to do your job. So I'm optimistic. I don't think we're going to disappear or go away, but the challenges are enormous, and we're going to have to work, you know, as a collective to be able to solve them. So I think as long as we remember, you know, again, the way this organization came to light, it came to light during a crisis. We survived that crisis, and we did it together as a government. And I see ISOO playing a cornerstone role in that, but I also don't see us playing it alone. So, you know, we'll go on.
John, if I may. Yep. So there's 4 of us up here on the stage, and we spoke about Steve's immense contributions earlier, and former Congressman Blanton before him. But, you know, the ISOO director is a very visible position. It's a very important role. But we're just one person. So there's an entire staff. They're here in the audience. There's staff that came, you know, before us and that will come in the future. But I'd just like to sort of close by thanking and recognizing the staff for all of their hard work that allowed us to do what we do.
Absolutely.
And I'll actually continue that a little bit too. So I'll also say you guys are going to have to clap again in a second too. And is that there are also a lot of information security professionals from agencies here as well who are tasked to do this day in and day out. And I'd like to kind of give yourselves each a round of applause too. Thank you very much for coming. And with that, let me invite Mark to come up for his closing remarks, and we will...
Yeah. Give me that wand. Yeah, thank you. That's all I need. Yeah. Well, may the force be with ISOO, right, for the next 40 years. Anyway, thank you again so much for coming. Again, we consider you all to be, you know, part of who we are. And again, we are not in this world alone by any stretch of the imagination, and we treasure our friendships with you all and the alliances we forge. And that means not only with our government colleagues, but also with our openness colleagues too, Tom. And thank you for your wonderful remarks. That said, like any good birthday party, we have a cake and we have refreshments. So they'll be right outside the door here. So we will see you for our 50th, I hope. Thank you so much. Yeah.